So last week we did a session on understanding and using the active living census. And if you're interested in a bit more information about the sample, the representativeness of the sample, how well it matches our population, I'd encourage you to go back and have a look at that. I will make that recording available and let you all know how you can access that as well, in case members of your team are interested. So in this section, we'll go through overview of health and wellbeing indicators, some information on overweight and obesity in the Shire, and some risk factors, so some health behaviours as well. There won't be a lot of in-depth information about the physical activity and recreation side of the survey or healthy eating and food security, because we'll go into depth on those areas in 2 further sessions. Very brief background to the active living census. The Shire-wide survey on health and wellbeing, a region-wide survey on health and wellbeing, conducted across the Loddon Campaspe region in May of last year, in 2019. So it was distributed to all households across Loddon Campaspe, together with a letter that encouraged and invited people to complete the survey online. So it could be completed and returned by post or online. And all in all, we received responses from just under 25,000 people across Loddon Campaspe, or just over 3,500 in Macedon Ranges Shire, which was roughly 8% of our residents who were eligible to take part. Again, if you're interested in a little bit more on that representation, I can share that other presentation with you. So we asked a series of questions, including several fairly standard measures of health and wellbeing. So those measures in bold are the ones that we'll touch on today. And all of those indicators have been reported for various demographics. So in the left-hand column, that summarises all of the measures we asked where people describe themselves or members of their household. So, for example, we can report on the proportion of people who gamble and how that varies according to your age, your gender, your perceived prosperity, so how well you're getting along financially, and several other indicators. That kind of detailed information is available in our top line report, and I'll give you an overview of those measures today. So starting off with self-reported health and wellbeing. So we asked 3 separate measures that measure general health and also a couple on wellbeing. So we can see here that for self-reported health, roughly in our Shire, about half of residents, 1 in 2 residents, felt that their health was either very good or excellent, which is quite high, and I'll give some comparisons in the next slide. On our 2 measures of wellbeing, we can see that there are a minority of residents who felt that their life satisfaction was low, so rated on a 0 to 4 out of 10, or that they weren't valued by society, so either no, they didn't feel valued or they didn't often feel valued. However, we'll drill down into that in the subsequent slides, and we can see that even though these experiences were reported by a minority of people, there was a real variation in those responses based on where you live or on your individual circumstances. So there are some real patterns of people who are more likely to have those adverse health and wellbeing outcomes. Now we'll start off with health. You can see that in Macedon Ranges Shire, actually, people were less likely to have poor health. So we were faring better on this outcome than some of the other shires within our region. So for example, in Macedon Ranges Shire, we're significantly lower to report poor health than in Central Goldfields or Loddon. But there were some differences or some patterns of difference across districts within our Shire. It appears that people in Lancefield and Romsey were more likely to report poor health, but they weren't statistically significant differences. So wherever I've got some arrows, that shows statistical significance. So it just means that there was a little bit of fuzziness around these estimates and maybe a little bit of overlap. We can't say with confidence it's not just due to chance. But you'll start to see for some of the other measures that there's a real pattern of similar differences across districts within our Shire. We do start to get this emerging pattern that people in Lancefield and Romsey perceive their health to be poorer. So looking now at differences in, again, still on self-reported health across age groups and also for people of different characteristics. You can see that similar pattern for men and for women, although interestingly for males, I guess in the younger adult group, so the 18 to 34-year-old group, there were more females than males who reported poor health. But generally there was this pattern of increasing, of decreasing health, more people reporting poor health as they get older, which is what we'd expect to see. We also see a pattern of poor health among people who are a bit more marginalised or have poor mental health. So people who need help with daily activities, 60% of them reported their health was fair or poor, just under 60%, 58. Similarly, people with low life satisfaction, so that's one of our indicators of poor mental well-being, 60% reported that they had fair or poor health. Similarly, we reported, there were more people saying their health was poor if they'd experienced food insecurity, or if they felt they didn't, or if they said they didn't feel valued by society as well. And as we look across some other measures, we start to see the same kind of groups of people falling through the cracks and reporting that either their physical health or their mental health was poorer. So these characteristics, we see them coming up time and time again. It was also, we saw patterns of poor health together with poor diet, low physical activity, smoking, and alcohol consumption. So all of these things were kind of occurring at the same time. Going to now the measures for well-being. So this first one is the one on low life satisfaction. And again, we see a similar pattern to poor health, where in Macedon Ranges there were fewer people who had low life satisfaction compared to Central Goldfields, where it was quite high. But again, we see this pattern across the Shire. And in particular, more people reporting low life satisfaction in Kyneton, Lancefield and Romsey than we saw in Gisborne. So that's what those arrows are indicating there, statistically significant differences. And we can see in Romsey, 1 in 10 people said that, they had poor mental health. So they reported their satisfaction with life 0 to 4 out of 10. Again, when we're looking at the differences across age groups, here we see quite a big difference by gender. So again, for men, we sort of see this increasing problem with low life satisfaction into older age, whereas for women, we see a real peak around young adulthood. The different life circumstances, I think, that are contributing to that, that poorer mental well-being for men versus women at those stages and ages of life. We see similar patterns of poor mental well-being with those other characteristics. So again, it's more of a problem for people who have poor general health, who don't feel valued by society, who are just getting along financially, or who've experienced food insecurity. But those same people are falling through the cracks. Again, those poor mental well-being outcomes occurring alongside low physical activity, daily alcohol consumption, and poor diet. I move through the last of these 3 well-being indicators, and this one is looking at feeling valued by society. So this one's a real indicator of that community connection, and it's another indicator of well-being as well. So again, we see actually in Macedon Ranges Shire, there are fewer people reporting they didn't feel valued by society than other areas in the region, again with that being highest in Central Goldfields. But again, when we look across the Shire into our districts, we see a very similar pattern where in Lancefield and Romsey, there's a much higher proportion of people reporting they don't feel valued by society than in Gisborne. So again, some of those smaller areas, and I guess the more regional areas within the Shire, we're seeing the poorer mental well-being and the poorer health outcomes as well. When we look at the differences by age and gender, it's a more similar pattern for males and females than what we saw with the general low life satisfaction. So again, we see it really quite high starting in for our young people, for our adolescents, and then continuing on into our young adults. So this problem with not feeling valued by society, often it's connected with not feeling like you have agency over things in your life or decisions that are made around you. And we can kind of see that reflected in that starting to emerge particularly for our young people, our adolescents. And for females aged 12 to 17, 23% of them said that they didn't feel valued by society. Similarly, among our young adult women, 18 to 34-year-olds, 24%, that's 1 in 4 people in that age group who are not feeling valued by society. And that has really important flow-on implications for general well-being, life satisfaction, and for health. We also see, again, really similar patterns where if you don't feel valued by society, it's more common among people with low life satisfaction, with poor health, people who are just getting along financially, and those who experience food insecurity. So in particular, I guess, to point out here, people with low life satisfaction, 61% of them didn't feel valued by society, so a real interconnection between those two. Also connected with having a poor diet and with smoking. So we start to see here, it's not that the two are causative, but it's very difficult to change those behaviours if there are other factors at play. They're really important ingredients for health and well-being, those social determinants of health that help people to access the things that they need to make changes in their life. Looking at overweight and obesity now, we can see that underweight is not so much of a problem within our shire, but that only 37% of people are within that healthy weight range, and actually 62% are an unhealthy weight of being overweight or obese. So when we compare that across our region, we see that this pattern is, we have high rates of overweight and obesity across all shires within the region. Macedon Ranges being quite similar to many of the other shires within the region as well. I don't have the statistical significance for these ones because the two are added together, but you can just see the general pattern. We do know that overweight and obesity is more of a problem in regional areas than in metropolitan areas, and some of that is due to the way our built environment exists and having opportunities for active transport and other factors that affect walkability, access to green open space, and those other areas that really encourage physical activity and also healthy eating as well. When we look within Macedon Ranges Shire, we can see again that we have lower rates of overweight and obesity in our more affluent areas of the Shire, and more of an issue in, again, Lancefield, Romsey, and also in Riddles Creek as well. So looking at differences between men and women of different age groups, you can see that overweight and obesity is more of an issue for males of all age groups than it is for females, but nonetheless there's still high rates overall. Obesity is most common, again, among people with low life satisfaction, so that indicator of poor mental well-being. 42% of people with low life satisfaction were obese, and 71% were either overweight or obese. Similarly, in the poor health category, almost 1 in 2 people with poor health were overweight or obese, and 79% were overweight or obese, with 50% being obese. So again, it's not causative. The two kind of reinforce each other. If you have poor health, it's often harder to lose weight, to be active, and to have a healthy diet, but then that reinforces the poor health. And we know that having a healthy diet and physical activity is really important for both mental well-being as well as physical well-being. Not unexpectedly, obesity is associated with low physical activity, and interestingly also with being an ex-smoker. And keep going through our health risk factors, and we'll pause and have an opportunity shortly after that for some discussion and some questions. So within our health risk factors, won't go into quite as much detail in some of these. The smoking rate that we see here at 8% is likely to be an issue with the survey sampling. That's because when we compare it to some of the benchmarks at a state level, it's much lower than what we would expect to see. So I wouldn't be using this as a prevalence of smoking. I think it's far better to be using our population health survey for the prevalence of smoking. But what we can do where this survey is really useful is looking at how smoking rates vary across our shire and for different population groups within our shire. Those sorts of comparisons are still really valid, and we don't have that sort of detailed comparison that we can't get that from the population health survey. The next slide will reveal a little bit more about that. Interestingly, smoking again higher in Lancefield and Romsey, where we see those problems with poor health generally and poor mental well-being as well. We asked a question on how often people gamble, and we see that 5%, so 1 in 20 people were gambling weekly, and that was higher in Kyneton than any other district in the Shire. Our measures of alcohol consumption, not all of those are comparable to other population health survey outcomes just because of the way that we ask those questions. The binge drinking measure is, and we see that 58% of people had 4 or more standard drinks on at least one occasion in the past year. And that's higher than what we see at a state level. It's similar to what we see in other regions, in other areas of Loddon and Campaspe. This is a very busy slide. I've just taken it out of the selected findings reports, really just to highlight a couple of things to you. And that is on alcohol consumption. So you can see for the binge drinking, it's more of an issue for males than females, particularly in those sort of young adult and middle-age groups. It tends to reduce into older age. And also you can see in the little wine stains there, the proportion of people who reported binge drinking was similar in Macedon Ranges than Loddon and Campaspe, but much higher than what we see at a state level. On smoking, the thing I wanted to point out here is that our smoking rates are much higher among people who identify as LGBTI, among people with a disability, and also among Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Those patterns are similar to what we see at state and national levels. So those same issues that exist at a national level also apply here within our shire. Gambling, you can see very clearly that there are far higher participation rates in gambling among males than among females. And although that's associated with where we see venues, so we see higher gambling in Kyneton, for example, online gambling is starting to become a real issue, particularly for our young men, and certainly we don't need access to venues to be gambling on a daily basis even. All right, there was a lot of information there, but also some repetition, I think, in some of the things that we see that are common among those health and wellbeing indicators. So I've just a couple of slides to summarise those. We can see from our data that people who report poor health also report poor mental wellbeing and vice versa, that those two really occur together. And that experiences differ by age and by gender. So generally poor health is increasing with older age, but for women, low life satisfaction, so that measure of poor mental wellbeing is most common in early to middle adulthood, whereas in men it increases with age. Whereas the higher proportions of both young men and young women are reporting that they don't feel valued by society. I think that's something we can really address at a shire level. When we look at poor health and wellbeing generally, we see that it's most common in Lancefield and Romsey, that we have some real issues for people who need assistance with daily activities. So that was sort of our proxy indicator for people with a disability. And also among people who experience financial or food insecurity. So those other aspects of vulnerability at a financial level. We also see poor health and wellbeing occurring together with some of those other health behaviours, so low physical activity and having a poor diet as well. Overweight and obesity is an issue in our shire. It's a problem for 3 in 5 of our residents who are not a healthy weight. It affects men more than women, and it's common for people with poor health and poor mental health. It's also associated with that area level disadvantage. So again, we see it occurring most prominently Lancefield and Romsey. Also an issue in Riddles Creek, potentially in our smaller areas, our less populated areas. Binge drinking, issue across the region, particularly for men, decreasing with older age. Similarly, gambling, more common in men as well. Smoking we see more common again in Lansfield and Romsey, and also for some of those population groups who are more vulnerable or more marginalised. So when we're thinking about these results, this slide is going to come up in all of the presentation, and it's really just a prompt for people to think not just about the individual factors, so not just about the individual life circumstances, but the communities within which people are living. And I think that's where that data at the district level is really valuable to help us to, to prompt those questions of why we're seeing those differences across our shire, in particular in Lansfield and Romsey, and what can we really do about that. It's important to consider the natural environment and the built environment. So what opportunities are we giving people to be active and well, to connect with those around them as well? So those are those really important social determinants of health. So those key ingredients for physical health and well-being that we know are so important to reduce overweight and obesity and chronic ill health as well. All of the really detailed findings occur in the top line report. So that one will soon be available on our website together with a little video on how to interpret the information, because it's a really data heavy report. 150 pages or more long, that particular report. So there's a lot of detailed information in there, and I'm very happy to be contacted to help you to interpret some of those findings or to find what you're looking for in that report as well. The selected findings report, much more user-friendly and something that can be shared with colleagues and also with community members. So that one is now available on our website. There are pages for, dedicated pages for different population groups, including kids, adolescents and older adults. A page that explores findings by gender and also for each district within the Shire, as well as some of those population groups that we really want to help to highlight issues with and to sort of start to seek out solutions for, including people who need assistance with daily activities. And at a regional level, we have data for people who identify as LGBTI and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as well, where the numbers were a little bit too small at a Shire level, but we can look regionally to some of those health issues and also solutions. So what we've done today is to go through self-reported health and well-being, a little bit on overweight and obesity and some of the risk factors. As I mentioned, there'll be more detailed exploration of healthy eating and food security and also physical activity and recreation. I'm sorry, I've just swapped the order of those two around. So the next week's one is on physical activity and recreation. All right.